President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine says actions will speak louder than words.
Today there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions, but strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves. They certainly will.
Well, our chief international security correspondent, Nick Paton-Walsh, has reported extensively from Ukraine, and he just filed this report.
The search for survivors after a Russian missile attack on Sumy Sunday night. 11 people here were killed, 2 of them children, when missiles hit a residential neighborhood in this city near Ukraine's border with Russia. Hours later, at least 8 people were killed in a strike on Odessa. Horrifically, this is now the norm for Ukraine, under near constant bombardment after 1,000 days of war. Zelensky saying strikes show, quote, what Russia is really interested in, only war. And that war is not going Ukraine's way right now, with sustained and slow losses along the Eastern Front. Perhaps a reason for the stark and significant policy change from the White House Sunday. Sources telling CNN that the US President Joe Biden has finally given Ukraine the go-ahead to use long-range American weapons to strike inside Russia. The weapons are primarily meant to help Ukraine hold on to Kursk, according to one US official. That's the region in southern Russia where Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive this summer. A potential bargaining chip for the Ukrainians in any future peace talks. Biden had refused for months to provide the weapons to Ukraine and then to permit them to strike inside Russia with them. But like previous decisions over HIMARS missiles, Abrams tanks and F-16 jets, Biden delayed and then finally consented. This change is unlikely to alter the battlefield overnight, owing to how few ATACMS Ukraine can get. But it's a critical decision, showing this outgoing White House is keen to help Ukraine and entangle the United States yet deeper into this war, just months ahead of Donald Trump taking office.
Hits are not made with words. Such things don't need announcements. Missiles will speak for themselves.
For Ukrainians, this is a little too late, this lady says. It should have been done at the very beginning, when Russia was too weak, another man adds. In Russia, the news is being reported on state TV, but so far, silence from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who's previously said Ukraine firing US-supplied ATACMS would be the equivalent of NATO entering the war. Putin's spokesperson Monday said Biden was throwing, quote, oil on the fire of the conflict. It'll burn brighter as both sides seek to maneuver ahead of the Trump presidency.
Well, Nick Paton-Walsh with us live from London, as well as Oren Lieberman, who's at the Pentagon. And let's start with you, Oren, and let's just unpack this decision. Why now?
For months, we've been given a number of different reasons or perhaps excuses why the U.S. wouldn't let Ukraine use these longer-range ATACMS missiles to strike inside Russia. There weren't enough of them. Russia had moved the main targets out of range. Ukraine was using them effectively in Crimea. Ukraine had better long-range drones for the targets they wanted to hit. And that we heard over and over again from the administration and from defense officials here. Now, it's unclear if any of that has changed. Were these simply excuses? Or is Ukraine going to get more of these missiles to have a greater effect with them? But one of the reasons the administration changed their position, at least from what we're being told, is because the U.S. viewed the deployment of North Korean troops to Russia, more than 10,000 in the Kursk region, as an escalation in and of itself, one that merited some sort of response. And this, at least in part in the waning days of the Biden administration, is part of that response. And that's where the U.S. sees Ukraine using these missiles in the Kursk region, where they are holding some Russian territory. Russia has amassed some 50,000 troops in an expected, or rather ahead of an expected attempt to try to re-seize that territory. And that gives Ukraine a number of targets they could hit with these. Command and control nodes, logistics nodes, concentrations of troops. And that, if used effectively, would allow Ukraine to hold that territory as long as possible, because if it comes to negotiations, if that's what President-elect Donald Trump is going to push for, then that territory that Ukraine is holding in Russia is an incredibly important bargaining chip. So that looks to be the goal here of opening up this option to Ukraine in the closing days of the war, as effectively both Ukraine, Russia, the US, and the West are all trying to figure out what comes next once Trump comes into office and what will this conflict look like. This is part of a growing attempt to strengthen Ukraine's position, although it's very late in the game. That much is obvious, Becky.
Let me bring you back in, Nick Oren. Thank you. You argue that Ukraine simply won't get enough of these long-range US weapons to alter the course of this war. And I just remind our viewers, you did spend a short period of time in Kursk earlier on this region, so you know the terrain and you know what's going on there. Just explain your argument here.
I mean, ultimately, it's just about inventory. If the United States was able to supply hundreds of these missiles immediately, if they're already in country, you could potentially see them striking at enough targets deeper inside Russia to impact any move by Russia using North Korean troops towards the Kursk region. It's, already shrinking Ukraine's grip inside Kursk. According to open source mapping and Western officials, it's gone from about 900 square kilometers to about 600 in the past few weeks since the invasion in August. But they are awaiting a larger Russian push. And there, of course, have been suggestions from Biden administration officials while they were prevaricating on this decision that essentially Russia has moved its attack aircraft further back, further deeper inside Russia, out of the range, potentially, of these ATACMS missiles anyway. So the number is probably going to mean the battlefield change isn't that enormous. We simply don't have great transparency, but it's unlikely that the excuse used by the Biden administration about the few numbers they have will suddenly evaporate. We know, too, that Ukraine is using longer range drones that are often more cheap, more effective, and President Zelensky sort of tried to fluff the answer when asked when he made his speech and potentially talked about when these missiles might start to be used. So we may not in fact have a flag going up when the first strike indeed occurs. But the big change here has really been the symbolism of, for months, President Biden saying we simply can't do this, it would be too escalatory, and then deciding, okay, fine, now it's time. There's 2-3 months left in which this potentially could come into effect. They could use these missiles. They'll probably, frankly, go through most of them in that short period of time. But the big thing it does is essentially put more US meat in the grinder here. That's a metaphorical term, putting the US further into this conflict. Vladimir Putin was clear. If you do this, essentially Ukraine firing US-made and supplied weapons, then it's really NATO joining them in the full war. That was a warning. We've seen red lines from Putin evaporate or turn murky when previous things have been supplied to Ukraine after a long delay by the Biden administration. But this final 2 to 3 months of the Biden White House is key. We know Trump may end up looking towards negotiations, however form indeed that takes. And so this flurry of activity, the Russians for the last months pushing hard on the front line, that continues. That's damaging for Ukraine. That's where the momentum certainly is. And on the other side now, the Biden administration reaching to the obvious tools in front of it that Ukraine has asked it to seize a while back and deciding to try and give Kiev a last-minute boost. It's going to make it potentially more complex for Trump to talk peace, you might say, or Trump may seem like such an ameliorating force to Putin that he has an easier ride. It certainly puts the US deeper into this. It gives the Ukrainians a bit more of a chance in the months ahead. And look, the last 72 hours have been quite extraordinary in this war. We're also seeing Germany launching unilateral diplomacy towards Vladimir Putin on Friday. That's shaken many European allies of Ukraine. And so, yeah, a lot's going to move before January, Becky.
Let's bring in CNN's Fred Pleitgen, who is in Moscow, and just explain the perspective from there.
Hi there, Becky. Well, there's essentially two things that the Kremlin is saying. On the one hand, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, he came out today, as you mentioned before, and he said that he believed that the outgoing administration, the Biden administration, was essentially pouring oil onto the fire of the Ukraine conflict, obviously saying fanning the flames, essentially, of the war in Ukraine, getting the United States deeper involved in it, and also saying, essentially, that he believes that the Biden administration is making it more difficult for the Trump administration, once it does take office, to try and mediate some sort of possible ceasefire or some sort of end to that very war. Now, of course, the Russians are saying all of this is very dangerous, and it's been quite interesting to hear from the Russians, because when you ask them specifically what could happen after this decision, what they'll tell you is, look, Vladimir Putin has already laid all of this out. And indeed, what we've seen in the past couple of weeks, Becky, is a large campaign by the Kremlin, by the Russians, to try and dissuade the Biden administration from making exactly the decision that it has now made. One of the things that Vladimir Putin said a couple of weeks ago is that this could be considered by the Russians, if these strikes happened, NATO directly entering the war against Russia. Those are the words of Vladimir Putin. And his rationale for that was that he says, look, weapons like the ATACMS, weapons like these sophisticated surface-to-surface missiles, but also missiles from other NATO partners, like, for instance, the United Kingdom and France, the Russians say those cannot be used. The targeting cannot happen without the help of specialists, as Vladimir Putin put it, from the countries where these weapons come from. So therefore, the Russians are saying they could consider something like this to be a direct attack by NATO or by the United States against Russia.